Hello everyone and welcome to Arcade Viking. Today is the official 23rd video and unofficial 17th video of my series on the early Imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is David Crockett, the Lion of the American Frontier, a very famous individual in United States history who was very prominent during the early Imperial United States, specifically during the Jacksonian era. Now, I have decided to do this video because I felt that this video was something that needed to be covered, mainly because of uh, Andrew Jackson's portrayal of himself as a representative of the common man during the 1820s and 1830s of the United States that would become the Jacksonian era. Now, obviously, that leaves a lot of questions. What was the common man? As this could be fairly variable and diverse depending on the region and profession. So, with that in mind, I have selected to do a video about David Crockett because he is sort of the prototypical example of the quote unquote common man that Andrew Jackson was specifically talking about uh, when he stated he was a representative of the common man. Okay, so first off, Davy Crockett is, as I already said, is one of the most famous individuals in the history of the United States. And many people, especially my people say I'm 32, so my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation are aware of Davy Crockett from things such as the Disney Studios movie series that portrayed Davy Crockett as a uh, roving hunter frontiersman who wore a his trusty coonskin cap, as you see in this picture. Now, this is not necessarily a completely inaccurate view. Davy Crockett was most certainly a hunter, as we'll talk about in this video, and he was most certainly a frontiersman. But there's also a lot of mythology and liberties taken in the Disney movies with how Davy Crockett actually was, especially pertaining to the fact that he preferred to go by David Crockett rather than Davy Crockett. So, with that in mind, we're going to dive into the life of David Crockett and see what uh, the sort of typical frontiersman, the typical common man that Andrew Jackson claimed to be the representative of, was like. Starting with his family and early life. So, David's family was descended from Scotch, Irish, and French Huguenot migrants to the Americas during the 1700s CE. Then, in around 1776 CE, David's family would move to part of northeast Tennessee, located within Daniel Boone's Transylvania Purchase, which I've already discussed and linked in a few videos, including my video on the American Revolution that I will link in the iCard. Also, during this time, just 1 year after David's family moved to the Transylvania Purchase, David's grandparents would die at the hands of Cherokee warriors in the Cherokee American War, which I've also done a video and linked on that I will link in the iCard. Then, during the American Revolution, David's father, John Crockett, would participate in the very famous Battle of Kings Mountain on October 7th, 1780 CE. And then after the American Revolution, John Crockett would become an advocate for the state of Franklin and the independent state of Franklin in northeast Tennessee, with this state being advocated for between 1784 and 1786 CE. Then, in on August 17th, 1786 CE, David Crockett would be born to John and Rebecca Crockett in a small cabin located in rural northeast Tennessee. With the Crockett family often struggling to meet ends meet, often falling on hard times, such as the destruction of John Crockett's grist mill during a flood. After forfeiting their property on which that grist mill was located in bankruptcy, the Crockett family would then move to Morristown, Tennessee, where John Crockett would construct a tavern in 1795 CE. Then, at the age of 12, David would work as an indentured servant on a cattle ranch in Tennessee, with this actually being very common because until he was 16, David would often work as an indentured servant to pay off his father's debts. Then, as an adult, after several failed relationships, David would marry Polly Finley in 1806 CE, and they would have three children, including John Wesley Crockett, between 1806 and 1813 CE. Which now leads us to our next section, David Crockett's experiences in the First Creek War. At the outbreak of the First Creek War in 1813 CE, David would join the Tennessee militia under Andrew Jackson to fight against the Red Stick faction of the Muscogee Creek Confederacy. And he actually talks in depth about his experiences in this war in his own autobiography, just simply titled "The Narrative of the Life of David Crockett of the State of Tennessee," as you can see here. One of the things David mentions several times in his autobiography about his experiences during the First Creek War is that he preferred to hunt rather than fight battles, which you can see here in this excerpt here, where he talks about a conversation he had with White Stick Creek, Muskogee Creek warriors who were fighting on the side of the United States, where he states that to him, his business was to hunt for just his fellows, as he described, and was determined not to go back until it had done until he had done it. And then he goes on to describe several more examples of this and his other experiences with the Allied White Stick. That being said, despite his preference to hunt in place of fighting battles, David and the Tennessee militia would battle Red Stick warriors several times, including a massacre of several Red Stick warriors by burning them in a house. And this is where I have to state, this is a trigger warning. There are very graphic descriptions that I am about to read ahead on the next slide. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to read an excerpt of David's account of this massacre. And he states, and I'm going to start specifically right here. He states, "We begin to close on the town, making our files closer and closer, and the Indians soon saw they were our property. So most of them wanted us to take them prisoners. Their squaws and all would run and take hold of any of us they could and give themselves up. I saw 7 squaws have hold of one man, which made me think of the scriptures. So I hollered out the scriptures was fulfilling. Then that there were 7 women holding on to one man's coattail, but I believe it was a hunting shirt all the time. We took them all prisoners that came out to us in this way, but I saw some warriors run into a house until I counted 46 of them. We pursued them until we got near the house, when I saw a squaw sitting in the door, and she placed her feet against the bow she had in her hand and took an arrow and raised her feet. She drew with all her might and let it fly at us. She killed the man whose name I believe was Moore. He was a lieutenant, and his death so enraged us all that she was fired upon and had at least 20 balls blown through her. This was the first man I ever saw killed with a bow and arrow. We shot them like dogs and then set the house on fire and burned it up with the 46 warriors in it. I recollect seeing a boy who was shot down near the house. His arm and thigh was broken, and he was so near the burning house that the grease was stewing out of him. In this situation, he was still trying to crawl along, but not a murmur escaped him, though he was only about 12 years old. So sullen is the Indian when his dander is up that he had sooner die than make a noise and ask for quarters. The number that we took prisoners being added to the number we killed amounted to 186, though I don't remember the exact number of either. We had 5 of our men killed. We then returned to our camp, at which our fort was erected and known by the name of Fort Strother. No provisions had reached us, and we had now been for several days on half rations. However, we went back to our Indian town the next day when many of the carcasses of the Indians were still to be seen. They looked very awful, for the burning had not entirely consumed them, but given them a very terrible appearance, at least what remained of them. It was somehow or other found that the house had a potato cellar under it, and an immediate examination was made, for we were all as hungry as wolves. We found a fine chance of potatoes in it, and hunger compelled us to eat them, though I had little rather not, if I could have helped it, for the oil of the Indians we had burned up on the day before had run down on them, and they looked like they had been stewed with meat. Uh, we then again returned to the army and remained there for several days, almost starving, as all our beef was gone. We commenced with eating the beef hides and continued to eat every scrap we could lay our hands on. And then, of course, the rest is just some more experiences in the war. Now, this, as you can see, and as the trigger warning suggested, this is a very, very graphic scene described. And yet, it's also very interesting. David does not shy from one admitting that he participated in this massacre, which is not an uncommon thing, but he also does not shy from describing the horror he felt in the graphic details. He also note he mentioned that he didn't call the Native Americans, the Red Stick Warriors, savages or barbarous or anything like that. The only thing he mentions is that they shot them like dogs, which, to be fair, could be taken in a number of ways. But many historians, when looking at it, have come to the conclusion, especially when looking at David's later career and his later views on Native Americans, which we'll talk about later in the video. When looking at them all together, it seemed very clear that this event horrified David, especially in the aftermath, especially with his, if not outright refusal to eat the potatoes, his at least aversion and probably, for the most part, refusal of eating the potatoes. That being said, I am not a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. It is not my place to pass judgment on David Crockett. It is their place. So I will leave it up to members of that nation to decide what conclusions to draw upon David Crockett. I just think it is important to note that he does seem to, in this excerpt, to have been horrified by his actions in this massacre and horrified by his complacency and his willful participation. And, with that being said, he and the Tennessee militia would continue to have several more skirmishes with Red Stick Warriors uh, before David, sick of the fighting, would return home to Tennessee, where he would stay until the end of the Creek War, returning to Tennessee on December 24th, 1813 CE. And you can see this here, and again, this excerpt from his autobiography, where he states that he began to feel as though he had done enough fighting for one time, and he remained home until the army had returned to the Horseshoe Bend and fought the battle there. And here is what the state of Tennessee would have looked like roughly in the 1810s CE. All right, now this brings us to our next section, David's second marriage and his private life. So tragedy would strike the Crockett family when Polly Crockett died in 1815 CE. Though with her after her death, David would remarry just a few months later to Elizabeth Patton. Then, after his remarriage and his return from the Creek War, David would participate very often in his favorite pastime, which was bear hunting. At one point, barely surviving an attack by a bear on one such hunt, where he claimed, and of course this could be just exaggeration, but he claimed that after he escaped the bear, um, he had to spend a good chunk of the night essentially climbing up and down a tree, uh, causing friction in his body to keep himself warm during the winter until he could find his way home. But again, that could be very much exaggeration. At one point during another hunt, David would contract malaria and would have to be nursed back to health by his members of his hunting party. And David would often frequent Methodist camp meetings, religious meetings, as the name suggests, that were accompanied by camping and gathering in the wilderness, where he would become well known for his ability as a public speaker and storyteller. And he would also, much like his father, begin to run multiple businesses, including a gunpowder mill and a whiskey distillery. Though, again, much like his father, often these ventures would fail, putting David in debt. Also, several times during his life, David would purchase and sell several enslaved Africans and African Americans, despite keeping an apolitical stance on whether or not chattel slavery should be expanded or abolished. And I do, as always, have to really drive home that the institution of chattel slavery was very much a horrific institution. And while the records don't outright state it, it's not a far leap to assume that David would inflict upon these enslaved individuals the same harsh punishments that would be inflicted upon enslaved Africans and African Americans by other white enslavers. All right, now this brings us to our next section, David's early political career. So David would first take public office in Lawrence County, Tennessee as a commissioner, helping to configure the new county's boundaries in 1817 CE. Then, in November 25th of the same year, on November 25th of the same year, the state legislature would appoint David State Justice of the Peace. Then on March 27th, 1818 CE, David would be elected lieutenant colonel of the 57th Regiment of Tennessee Militia, defeating candidate Daniel Matthews for the position. Despite these appointments, David would eventually feel his public responsibilities were beginning to consume much of his time and energy so much of his time and energy that he had little left for either his family or his businesses. So he would resign from the office of Justice of the Peace and from his position with the regiment, though he would remain the county commissioner. And then he would return to his cabin and family in 1819 CE. Now, this brings us to our next section, David's experiences in the Tennessee General Assembly. So, just 2 years after David resigned from being the Tennessee Justice of Peace and resigned from his position in the Tennessee militia, David would officially resign as county commissioner of Lawrence County and would decide to run for the Tennessee General Assembly in 1821 CE. David would win the election, becoming the representative of both Lawrence and Hickman counties in Tennessee. Less than 2 weeks after David's election in 1821 CE, a flood on the Tennessee River would destroy David's businesses and would force David to sell most of his land to pay off his debts. During his time on the Tennessee General Assembly, David would fight for the rights of impoverished settlers who he felt dangled on the precipice of losing the titles to their land due to the state's complicated system of grants. And he would also become an early political opponent of Andrew Jackson, who, as we already discussed in the video on the Jacksonian era, would often portray himself as a representative of the common man, despite being a wealthy plantation owner and therefore not actually a member of the common man, of the common people of the United States. David's opposition to Jackson can be seen in his support of William Carroll as governor of Tennessee over Jackson's candidate, and his backing of John Williams, Jackson's opponent in the Senate election of 1823 CE, with the support of these individuals happening between 1821 and 1823 CE. David would be reelected to the General Assembly in 1823 CE, representing multiple Tennessee counties, including Carroll and Humphrey counties, and a couple of more between 1823 and 1824 CE, where he would continue to fight for the right of impoverished farmers. And now this brings us to our next section, David's time and experiences in the House of Representatives. So, on October 25th, 1824 CE, David would announce his intention to run for the House of Representatives. However, in 1825 CE, he would narrowly lose the election to the incumbent Tennessee representative Adam Rankin Alexander. Shortly after this, on September 24th, 1825 CE, in return for his services in the War of 1812 CE, specifically during the First Creek War, David would receive a military land grant for 20 acres of land in Lawrence County, Tennessee. Hoping to raise enough money to pay off his debts and his past due bills, David would hire workers to chop down 30,000 trees on his land in Lawrence County, with the plan to sell the timber in the New Orleans barrel making industry, as this was a very lucrative industry at the time, with this felling of the 30,000 trees happening throughout the spring of 1826 CE. After the timber was felled, David and his workers would load the timber on float boats for transportation down the Mississippi River. However, shortly after departure, the boats would capsize, resulting in David almost drowning, as well as the loss of both the timber and David's own pants. The timber would be the only thing that would never be recovered. Then, after this debacle in September 15th, 1826 CE, David would announce his opposition to the cotton tariff proposed by John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, and his intention to run for the House of Representatives a second time. David would win the election for the House of Representatives in 1827 CE. And as we've already discussed several times in multiple videos in the series, Andrew Jackson would win the presidential election of 1828 CE, the year after David won the election for the House of Representatives. During his time in the House of Representatives, David would continue his legislative focus on settlers getting a fair deal for land titles, offering the H.R. 27 amendment to a bill sponsored by James K. Polk in 1828 CE. David would be reelected to the House of Representatives in 1829 CE and would introduce a resolution to abolish the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York, because he felt that it was public money going to benefit the sons of wealthy men. And in 1830 CE, David would be the only Tennessee politician to oppose Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act. As already discussed in our previous video on the Jacksonian era, right here is a primary document that is a sketch of the speech that David gave in the House of Representatives on his opposition to the Indian Removal Act. That being said, it's not the actual speech. It is somebody recounting the sort of broad points of David's speech. So I will not be reading this excerpt here, but you can pause to read this page as well as these two subsequent pages here. But the general broad strokes are that he, much like several other politicians who were opposed to the Indian Removal Act, he felt that the rights of the Native Americans, including the Cherokee, were being infringed upon, especially considering they had been their steadfast allies, and that he had actually talked with many Native Americans, including individuals of the Chickasaw Nation, who stated that they would rather die than leave their homes. And so David stated that he understood that and he would do everything he could to protect their rights. And he also stated that there should be amendments passed that would be like essentially sending out surveyors to survey the land, and Native Americans should only be removed if they were willing to, not forcibly, and that the United States should definitely protect them and uphold the rights that the United States had already promised Native Americans in multiple treaties. Now, that being said, David does, in his autobiography, very much state his essentially what his opinion was and still it was during that speech and still was at the time that he was writing the autobiography. And I will read an excerpt of that here, where he says, "Gentlemen, I opposed Andrew Jackson in his famous Indian bill, where $500,000 were voted for expenses, no part of which has yet been accounted for, as I have seen. I thought it extravagant as well as impolitic. I thought the rights reserved to Indians were about to be frittered away, and events prove that I thought correct. I had considered a treaty as the sovereign law of the land, but now saw it considered as a matter of expedience or not, as it pleased the powers that be. Georgia bid defiance to the treaty-making power and set at naught the Intercourse Act of 1802. She trampled it underfoot. She nullified it, and for this she received the smiles and approbation of Andrew Jackson. And this is what induced South Carolina to nullify the tariff. She had a right to expect that the president was favorable to the principle, but he took up the rod of correction and shook it over South Carolina and said at the same time to Georgia, "You may nullify, but South Carolina shall not." This was like his consistency in many other matters. When he was a senator in Congress, he was a friend to the internal improvements and voted for them. Everything that he could cement the states together, but giving them access to one another, to one to the other, was right. When he got into power, some of his friends had hard work to dodge and follow and shout. I called off my dogs and quit the hunt. Yes, gentlemen, Pennsylvania and Ohio and Tennessee and other states voted for him as a supporter of internal improvements. Was he not a tariff man? Who dare deny it? When did we first hear of his opposition? Certainly not at his expression that he was in favor of a judicious tariff. That was supposed to be a clincher, even in New England, until after the power lifted him above the opposition of the supporters of the tariff. So, as you can see in this, this excerpt goes on for a little bit longer. But even as you can see in just this excerpt alone, one, he is stating that he very much believed that the Indian Removal Act was wrong because it was trampling on the rights promised to Native Americans by the United States in treaties. And he was pointing out the hypocrisy of Andrew Jackson in punishing South Carolina during the nullification crisis, something I mentioned in the Jacksonian era video that I will link in the iCard. Yet, when Georgia was doing the exact same thing, Jackson was, because Native Americans were involved, Jackson was very much willing to um, allow Georgia to do essentially what they wanted. Um, and he was also pointing out his hypocrisy revolving internal improvements and tariffs and things like that, which of course were connected to, for those of you who watched my Jacksonian era video, were connected to the whole reason the nullification crisis happened. So, and also to go back a little bit to the excerpt of Crockett's participation in the massacre of the Red Stick Muskogee Creek Warriors, um, this opinion, as well as his opposition of the Indian Removal Act in the Senate, combined with his description of that massacre and his autobiography, are all together are sort of the things that point to historians that David Crockett, one, regretted participating in that massacre, and two, that he was, well, but in his own words, was very much a steadfast ally of Native Americans at the, one could argue, at the expense of his own political career in a lot of ways. And of course, despite, as David Crockett mentioned in that excerpt we just read, and despite heavy opposition from many politicians and political groups and missionary groups, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act would be passed by a narrow vote of 28 to 19 in the Senate and 101 to 97 in the House of Representatives on April 24th, 1830 CE. David's opposition to the Indian Removal Act was highly unpopular in his district and actually resulted in David losing the next election to William Fitzgerald in 1831 CE. That being said, David would, in 1833 CE, be re-elected to the House of Representatives and would yet again propose legislation to help impoverished Tennessee farmers. However, it never made it as far as being debated on the House floor, in large part to the heavy opposition of Andrew Jackson and his supporters in the House of Representatives. And David would serve on the House of Representatives this time between 1833 and 1835 CE. Then, during this time, David would join the Whig Party as a potential anti-Jacksonian candidate for the upcoming presidential election of 1836 CE, with David being portrayed as a popular coonskin politician. Yes, this is where David first had his reputation, or his connection to the coonskin cap. With his potential candidacy uh, with his potential of being the Whig candidate in the presidential election, David would embark on a speech giving tour to obtain support for a potential presidential campaign. However, he was not chosen as the Whig presidential candidate. Then in 1835 CE, David would lose the next election in the House of Representatives to Adam Huntsman. And also, this would be the time that he would write his autobiography that we've already read excerpts from a couple of times in this video. Another major event that happened in David's life was the fact that David's constant campaigning for political office or near constant campaigning for political office would lead him to begin neglecting his family, which would heavily strain their relationship. Now, this brings us to our next section, David Crockett's relationship with the Texas Revolution. So, seeking a new start for his family, in part to repair his damaged relationship with his family, David would gather 30 volunteers and would leave for Texas to join the Texan Army on November 1st, 1835 CE. David and his men would arrive in Nacogdoches, Texas, where David would meet the commander of the Texas Army, his old friend and fellow veteran of the First Creek War, Sam Houston, with them meeting in January of 1836 CE. Against Houston's advice, David and 5 of the men that he brought would leave to join the garrison at the Alamo Mission in the city of Behar, also known as Bexar, between February 6th and February 8th of 1836 CE. Then, between February 23rd and March 6th of 1836 CE, the Mexican army would lay siege to the Alamo for 2 weeks before massacring the entire Texan army present at the Alamo, including David. Accounts of David's death vary, with some saying that he fought to the death while using his musket as a club, and others claiming he was executed by the Mexican army the day after the Battle of the Alamo. Now, this brings us to our last section, the legacy of David Crockett. So, first off, after the end of the Texas Revolution, a coffin would be created for the Alamo garrison, with David Crockett's name being among those inscribed on the lid. The coffin is thought to have been buried in a peach tree grove, but the spot was not marked and can no longer be identified. A replica of the coffin currently sits on display at the San Fernando Cathedral in San Antonio, Texas. Elizabeth Patton Crockett and the Crockett family would migrate to the Republic of Texas, receiving 320 acres of land in return for David's service. Elizabeth would remain in Texas for the rest of her life and would reportedly wear black every day since David's death to express her deep mourning. When she died, she was buried in her black dress, with her living and eventually dying in the Republic of Texas between 1838 and eventually the state of Texas in 1854 CE. David's son, John Wesley Crockett, would become a member of the House of Representatives for Tennessee, representing his father's own district between 1837 and 1841 CE. David would be mythologized into a heroic pantheon of Texas founders, such as Stephen F. Austin, known as the father of Texas, and martyrs from the Battle of the Alamo and the Goliad Massacre, such as Jim Bowie, and of course David himself, also being a quote unquote martyr of the Battle of the Alamo. And also, as we are talked about briefly at the beginning of this video, David would be mythologized as Davy Crockett, the quote king of the wild frontier, in various songs, books, and movies. All right, that brings us to the end of our video. As always, as I've said in the past previous videos, I really hope you enjoyed hearing about the life of David Crockett. I, hope a lot of you were pleased to hear about his opposition to the Indian Removal Act. But that being said, I do hope that you were not pleased to hear about his views on the institution of chattel slavery and his by proxy probable treatment of enslaved Africans and African Americans. As I've said in the previous videos, I understand that that is very odd for the person making the video to state. That being said, I bring that fact up, or that potential fact up, not for entertainment, but to highlight an important difficult fact of life that is often overlooked or downplayed, at the very least, in the education system of the United States. So with that, I'm going to end the video. If you would like to see me cover any of the subjects I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And I hope you all have a good day.